We turn our attention now to an introduction to the Enlightenment, and in particular to the extraordinary generation in European thought, the generation of 1680 to 1715. We have the advantage of hindsight, understanding what happens in the 18th century. It would not have been obvious at the time, looking at this generation, how revolutionary the changes were that were occurring within it. It was still very much of a mixed intellectual world. The persistence of tradition is dramatically strong. The Aristotelian scholastics still dominate the universities. The curriculum does not reflect the changes that swept European knowledge in the 17th century. Skepticism and fideism, the belief in the weakness of human reason and the necessity of faith, remain vital, powerful currents in Europe, but they are formally condemned in Catholic Europe, and they are about to be swept away throughout Europe by the new confidence in the natural philosophy of the 17th century. There is a resurgence of mysticism in Europe at the very end of the 17th century, and it is a strong current of belief and practice, but increasingly it is being identified as a dangerous enthusiasm or indeed as a superstition. What marks the generation of 1680 to 1715 above all is the emergence of what the culture actually calls the new philosophers. It is they who are setting the terms of debate and increasingly winning the affections of the growing reading public. That reading public perceives the new philosophy to have both theoretical strength, above all the new empirical philosophies embodied by Bacon and, as we shall see, Locke, and to have a concrete accomplishment in the Newtonian achievement and synthesis that demonstrates the power and the success of the new philosophy. One way to think of the new philosophy that is winning the reading public during this generation is to compare the way Europeans convinced each other or believed that they should convince each other as the 17th century dawned with how Europe was persuaded as the 18th century dawned. The form of argument that dominated European universities throughout the 17th century, inherited from the medieval universities, was the disputatio, the disputation. How did one prove an argument? How did you convince someone that you were right and he was wrong? When did you know that you yourself, as a reasonable, rational person, ought to change your mind? In the form of the disputation, what held primacy was authority, intellectual authority. Those texts that had stood the test of time from which we could draw our axioms. Knowing what was true axiomatically, we proceeded logically in the manner of geometers, by deduction from premises known with certainty from the authority of inherited texts. One deduced what followed from them. The role of experience in the disputation is minor. We already know what is true from authority and logical deduction from authority. Knowing it is true, we know there will be instances of it in the world, and so we offer some examples from experience of what we already know to be true. So if the issue is witchcraft, we have the authority of ancient texts establishing the truth about witchcraft. We make logical deductions from that. We need some illustrations. We turn to various trials to show the reality in experience of witchcraft. That whole model of persuasion is being overturned in this generation. There is a rejection of the presumptive authority of the past, an overturning of authority as a model of where to begin our inquiry into knowledge, and a growing recognition of the rights of natural reason, even in the presence of human interpretations of theological authority. If we are not going to draw our understanding of the world from authority, then deduction is no longer the model of reason that we are going to use, but rather what is perceived as having worked in the new science of the 17th century, we will perceive inductively from the logic of inference, moving from the particulars of nature to a set of generalizations from those principles, which means that what had been last in the sequence of the Disputatio experience now is first in the model of knowledge of the new philosophy. The book we shall turn to is the book of nature. And knowledge from experience linked to experiment becomes the beginning of the search for truth. Let experience and nature, inductively, logically understood, decide what we believe about the world in which we find ourselves. The overturning of the presumptive authority of the past lets the genie out of the bottle. It's not something that can be contained. Europe now understands that it is free to reject the past as a model, that what had been true in astronomy and physics, the overturning of texts that had stood as authorities for centuries, indeed for millennia, was true about all claims of knowledge in natural philosophy, which could be re-examined afresh, anew. There is a growing sense in this generation that Europe in the 17th century had acquired something that would alter both knowledge and the human relationship to nature, proper method, a proper use of the human mind. And rightly or wrongly, this generation associated the awesome accomplishments of 17th century natural philosophy, science, with induction from nature, ordered by reason into laws of nature that were as general and as universal as possible, confirmed by experiment and by experience, and wherever possible, put to the use of mankind and its betterment. With the universities in general, and with only a handful of exceptions, closed to the new philosophy, there is a shift in the location and the new centers of influence of intellectual change. A movement away from the universities and the religious orders to new scientific and intellectual academies being founded by kings, by nobles, by aristocrats, all throughout Europe at this time. There is a new prominence given learned journals that attract very wide readerships that discuss the accomplishments and the nature of the new philosophy. And indeed, informal meeting places. There are coffee houses and pubs all across Europe that become major centers of intellectual gathering and influence. There is a growing secular reading public with a will to know, a hunger to read the new philosophy, and they are reading the accomplishments and the minds of the 17th century with an extraordinary exhilaration. That audience also creates a market for something quite remarkable in European intellectual life, and quite remarkable in its influence on the 18th century, the popularization of abstract and abstruse philosophy, the explanation for the ordinary reader of what has been accomplished in 17th century science and philosophy and political thinking. The self-image of the new philosophers of this transitional generation is seen in their emerging heroes. What sides of 17th century authors have become those authors' legacy for the dawn of the 18th century? This is a generation that passionately read Francis Bacon and saw him as teaching that one learns from nature, that one must avoid above all the idols of the theater, the inherited authority of ancient authors. That method is the essential task of philosophy, and that the proper method is induction. That is, if you'll recall our lecture on Bacon, the path that, whether we move swiftly or slowly on it, leads us toward real knowledge of the world, and that knowledge is a human power that, applied, can change our relationship to the world. They read Descartes with enthusiasm, and they read him above all as proclaiming the rights of reason, the right of philosophy to begin in doubt, the right to be rationally persuaded of all things. They read Descartes with enthusiasm in his quest for order and clarity and knowledge of the operations of the physical world, and are excited by his sense that we can have a mechanical knowledge of the forces of nature. They read Galileo with enthusiasm and see him as a symbol of the absolute necessity of the freedom to philosophize, the freedom of natural philosophy. They accept Galileo's instruction that we must look not in human books, but in nature, God's book for knowledge, and that the language of that book of nature is mathematics, and that we must quantify our understanding of nature and physical phenomena. They read with great enthusiasm John Locke, to whom we will turn in the next two lectures, and they read Locke as a new philosopher in the Baconian tradition, who believed that the boundary of our knowledge was our experience of the world, that we should admit ignorance on all matters beyond human experience, and that all knowledge was constructed from confirmable units of simple experience, and that all claims of knowledge could be examined in such a light. And they read with more than enthusiasm Isaac Newton, and see in his accomplishment the power of the new model of natural knowledge. Three laws of motion and the law of universal gravitation, and this generation believes both celestial and terrestrial physics fall into place. Newton is for them the very model of inductive, natural philosophy and the power of that model. They also draw from Newton a sense that they live in a universe that not only is not beyond human understanding, but that is lawful and designed in ways that we may know. And they believe also from this that one sees through nature and its laws and the wisdom of its order to nature's God. There is in this generation a sea change in attitudes underlying intellectual life. One sees these in the marks of the new philosophy. Again, what could be more dramatic than the rejection of the presumptive authority in the past and the extension of that rejection of that presumptive authority beyond issues of pure science to the whole enterprise of human knowledge. One sees it in the embrace of empiricism, learning from experience, in the embrace of quantification, a nature reducible to mathematical law. In the Aristotelian worldview, every particular entity acted from the nature of its own being and its own purposes. One wanted an understanding based upon an almost infinite series of particular explanations. In the new model of knowledge, the more general, the more universal a law, the more powerful the explanation is deemed to be. One simple formula in physics, velocity equals time times acceleration. There is a force, gravity, that varies directly in proportion to two masses inversely to the square of the distances between them. They are stated mathematically two simple laws that make this generation believes the universe comprehensible. The new philosophy is also a cultural and a religious revolution, as well as a philosophical revolution. Prosecution and persecution of witchcraft reached its high watermark in European history, not in the Middle Ages, not in the Reformation, but in the early to mid decades of the 17th century. And then in one generation, in the late 17th century, the assault upon witchcraft belief, part of a larger assault upon what is deemed superstition and claims of knowledge beyond experience, overturns the entire edifice of European witchcraft persecution and mania. And the educated classes of Europe impose upon the rest of the culture an end to witchcraft denunciations and trials and persecutions. One sees this as well in the growing location of God's providence in natural laws, in the ordinary but now wondrous, ordered laws and operations of nature. In some ways, for this generation, it had been as if there always had been in the center of town a complex clock. And every time the hand reached an hour, out would come St. George and clang the exact number of hours against the side of a dragon. And people thought, how miraculous, how astonishing. There must be an invisible agent that comes in, that coordinates, that brings St. George out, that strikes. There must be all of these particular acts of a wise, invisible being intervening to keep things running right in the world, to give us the appearance of order. But with the belief that one now understands the operation of natural law, the model is no, the wisdom lies in the design of the original clockmaker. That clock was created with mechanisms that coordinate by mechanistic action, reflecting the extraordinary intelligence and design of the creator of that clock. It is very dramatic to relocate one's sense of religious awe from the particular to the general, from interventions in the natural order to the creation of the natural order itself. It produces what we can best think of as a new religious aesthetic in which what seems most supreme and wise and infinitely intelligent and infinitely powerful about God is not particular providence, interventions in the world to bring about rain, to bring about climate, to bring about the body's healing, but the very general laws of providence that lead to survival, to the procreation of species, to the maintenance of a relationship between human beings and nature in which crops grow and life might flourish. But note that this poses problems for the religious beliefs of Christian Europe that will haunt and obsess the 18th century, for it raises the problem of miracle. If God's providence is to be located in the general laws of nature, if the wisdom is in the self-regulating design of the world, then an intervention would be like someone having to come and repair that clock in the town square. And if what one admired was the infinite wisdom of the original design, intervention poses a real problem for that admiration. And the problem of miracle is there at the heart of the dilemmas of the new philosophy. In both England and France, at the end of the 17th century and at the dawn of the 18th centuries, there are similar debates that rend the culture, debates about whether the ancients or the moderns are more to be admired. How extraordinary that this debate should be occurring at all in Europe, but yet more extraordinary is the conclusion ultimately reached in both cultures debating that issue, that the past may well be superior in its art, in its poetry. Perhaps there never again will be so great an epic poet as Homer, or so great a tragedian as Sophocles, but knowledge and science are cumulative. We know more about the world than the ancients. Our knowledge is superior. Our science is superior. And knowledge creates progress. The more we know about the real causes of things, the more we may change the world according to the human heart's desire for happiness. The new philosophy believes itself to be deeply religious, but it is involved in a very complex relationship with religious orthodoxy around it, and it will generate a set of profound problems for European religious belief. For it wants to remove theology from areas that it deems not properly in its sphere. And it desires profoundly to state a theology and devise a theology consistent with and evolving with increases in natural knowledge. These are revolutionary phenomena that will further secularize the West. The new philosophy's implications for the profoundest religious issues can scarcely be overstated in terms of their importance. Europe believes it possesses a book, Revelation, that is from God. It believes that book to be true because supported by miraculous signs, by wonders, by things beyond the powers of nature. But the new philosophy asks minds to look in the book of nature and to admire not the miraculous, but the order of the world. The implications of the new philosophy for ethical thinking are equally dramatic. If what we admire about God's design is found in the laws of nature, and if it is a law of all living things, including human beings, that we seek happiness and flee pain, which had been a commonplace observation of the West, why then one might reach so revolutionary a conclusion that it was self-evident from nature that the pursuit of happiness was ordained by God Himself. And that radical notion, embedded in the foundational documents of the American Revolution in a profoundly Protestant Christian America, that notion that God wills the pursuit of happiness, that happiness is the highest ethical notion in this world, it is there implicit in looking to the laws of nature to discover God's will. And note that this is not a revolution from without, an invasion of European thought by foreign sources. These transformations are occurring within Christian culture, which itself will produce the intellectual currents that make possible its own displacement from the center of European intellectual life. The 18th century begins with intense theological commitments and Christian commitments by the literate and learned world. And one of the things we will come to understand in the course of studying the 18th century is how anti-religious and often specifically anti-Christian attitudes and how secularism arise as unintended consequences from that initial deep theological perspective. By the end of the 17th century, we stand at nothing less than the birth of modern consciousness. Scientific, secular, inquiring, committed to intellectual freedom, seeking a principle of intellectual authority apart from mere tradition and repetition, but tempted at times by skepticism and leaps of faith, critical and erudite, and for certain confused by the range of choices that it has created for itself. For better or for worse, we are the heirs of the 17th century mind, living in its light and in its shadows. And those shadows would be described by many in the 18th century itself. A fear of materialism and naturalism and a loss of the sense of the wondrous and the divine and the miraculous in life, and the problem of progress. As we make ourselves more knowledgeable and more powerful, do we, in fact, make ourselves more moral and more happy? Those are dilemmas bequeathed to us with which Western thought will wrestle for the next 3 centuries. Thank you very much.